Hey folks, it's me, Mr. Lang, your friendly neighborhood biology teacher, and today we are going to talk about evolution and some ideas that are uh, connected with evolution. It's really important that we start by realizing that nothing that we could possibly talk about in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution and evolutionary change over time, along with the geologic timescale that we need for that to happen. Today's video is going to really focus heavily on Charles Darwin and his ideas around natural selection, and maybe a little more than normal about the history of how those ideas came to be. They didn't necessarily come directly from him. They did. He was the guy and is the guy that is sort of credited as being the father of evolutionary theory. However, it's also important to realize that there were some other things going on in the world and in Darwin's world at the time that helped him to come to those ideas. So this is what that video is mostly about. So Darwin is British. He was upper middle class, and he fancied himself sort of a hobby naturalist, collecting butterflies and things like that. He was a natural history buff, and he ended up accepting a position as ship's naturalist on this boat called the Beagle. And now he knew that he was going to go out around the world and he was going to be gone for a couple of years. So, because of that, he decided that he probably ought to bring some books. He didn't know anybody who was going on the trip, and who knows if they're bad company, but books are always good company. So he had this essay on the principles of population by Thomas Mathis with him, and he also had Principles of Geology by Charles Lyell. So those were floating around the ocean with him as he went. Um, and that wasn't really all. There were some other things, but it goes back even further than Lyell and Wallace. We'll come back to those two in a couple of minutes. But you have to realize that the whole idea of evolutionary thought doesn't start with Darwin. It starts long before Darwin. In fact, the ancient Greeks actually they didn't have a word for evolution, but they had ideas for how changes happened. So feel free to read this little paragraph about Anaximander um, who had the basics of evolution sort of pegged, though it's a really primitive basis. And then, if you want to read this quote really quickly, this is a poem that was written by Erasmus Darwin, who was Darwin's grandfather. Erasmus Darwin died in 1802, and this was posthumously published in 1803. The volume itself is it's a book length poem. It's not just a little poem, but this is one of the excerpts from it, and most of it is about this particular part. Just really rings of evolutionary change. So Darwin wasn't really the first person to think about evolution in this way, but he had a lot of experiences and a lot of family support that led him to be able to sort of express his ideas in a different way. You have to remember that if we're talking about the 1800s, this is a deeply religious time, and a lot of evolutionary thought really flew in the face of religion in general. So people were a little bit shy to throw big ideas out, and that's probably why Erasmus Darwin um, published this as a piece of art and poetry rather than as some sort of scientific discovery. So moving along, we have Anaximander, we have Erasmus Darwin, we've got Charles Lyell's book over here. We had Thomas Mathis's book on population that were all floating around in the ocean with Charles Darwin as they went from place to place. And one of the places that they went that really sort of cemented in Charles Darwin's head was South America, and they were in the Andes. And while they were in the Andes, uh, he actually got off the boat because he was prone to seasickness and wanted to be on land as much as possible. But while he was there in the Andes, he found fossils way, way, way up high in the Andes Mountains, way, way, way far away from a large body of water that would have produced them. And that sort of led him to realize that the things that Lyell was writing about in his Principles of Geology might be true. He also saw lots of really strange organisms. So if you look down here, you'll see a normal-sized armadillo, and this is an actual real armadillo-like organism that existed on Earth. And Darwin found fossils of things like this that just showed that things hadn't stayed the same over time. And with Lyell's geologic timeline for change, he started to realize that the whole idea that things might actually change over time really was a possibility. Um, so one of the places that they really hung out was off the coast of Ecuador. It's about 600 miles off the coast of Ecuador, and it's right here. That's the Galapagos Islands. You probably heard about the Galapagos Islands. And while Darwin was on the Galapagos Islands, he focused on lots of different things. Probably most famously would be the finches that um, have different beak shapes for different food that they exploit on different islands. Although he didn't really have a huge focus on those while he was there, but we have some swimming iguanas that don't really exist anywhere else. We've got tortoises that have different shell shapes based on the foods that they eat on different islands. So he was looking at this little microcosm of evolutionary change happening right in front of him. There are also things like cormorants. These are frigate birds, but there were cormorants that were flightless. We have cormorants here around Lake Champlain that fly all the time, but these cormorants don't have any reason to fly because they don't have any predators on the ground that would take them out. So over time, those longer wings basically just um, presented a hindrance to their survival because they couldn't swim as fast and catch as many fish with big wings. So they've got wings, but they're flightless. Um, so Darwin was seeing all of these things, and it made him start to think. Um, he's reading Thomas Malthus, and he's Malthus is talking about tremendous reproductive capacity, but population size. We don't have one species overrunning the entire world. Things are being kept in check. Lyell's book is leading him to realize that the Earth's surface has changed a lot over time, and he's seeing things that are showing him that present day creatures are similar to things that exist in his time, but a little bit different. So all of those things and all of his past and all of his history kind of came to a head, and he started thinking about things, and he thought about things for a long time. Darwin wanted to get things right. He didn't want to rush to publish his ideas. Um, One of the other things that helped him out was he was a pigeon breeder. And if you look at all of these, they don't all look like pigeons, but they literally are all different versions of pigeons that come from the original pigeon that you see all over the place. And they're the result not of natural selection, but they're the result of people saying, "Oh, I want a completely dark pigeon." So they bred the darkest pigeons over and over again, and they end up with a dark pigeon. Or I want the lightest color pigeon, or I want the biggest pigeon, or the littlest pigeon, or the one with a puffy head. And they end up with these traits that are expressed in individuals through artificial selection. It's not unlike dog breeding, for example. Everything comes from the gray wolf, and we have all sorts of dogs from mastiffs down to chihuahuas. Um, and they all have different looks and different things that they're good at. So that's artificial selection as well. Not that this is natural selection, but it did give Darwin some more things to think about. Um, Darwin got something else to think about too after he'd been thinking about all of these ideas for a while. Um, and that thing to think about came in the form of a letter from this guy. His name is Alfred Wallace, and he, it turns out, was studying the same stuff that Darwin was studying. And he wrote Darwin a letter saying, "Hey, Charles, I've been thinking about this." And he went on to explain basically exactly what Darwin had come up with as far as his theory for natural selection. And for Darwin, that really lit a fire under his butt. And he decided um, he better go ahead and start publishing his his work on this subject. So he actually published a book called On the Origin of Species. He and Wallace presented it to a whole bunch of natural societies around England and around Europe, but Darwin really gets Darwin gets the credit when it comes to that. So that's sort of the history of Charles Darwin. And then I want to talk about natural selection just a little bit. And I want to use one tiny example. I've got my cartoon mice up here. If you look, we've got different fur colors. We've got everything from brown down through light tan as possible fur colors for individuals. Every single trait that exists in every single organism in the world exists in a spectrum. That means that there's variation in the traits. And because of that, because every organism exists in a different place on the spectrum for all the different traits, no two organisms are exactly alike when you look at all of their traits combined. Nature always determines which organisms get to reproduce. And that's always based on the current environment. So whatever phenotype or whatever showing of any given trait most um, is most appropriate or helps the thing survive the most is going to allow that organism to survive. So for example, if these live in a really cold climate that's snowy most of the time, well, these mice are probably going to survive better because they're not going to get picked off by predators as much. But in a woodland area, these mice might survive better because these ones would stick out more and the predators would pick them off. So nature determines which ones get to reproduce, and the ones that get to reproduce are passing their genes along and making more organisms that look like them. That is natural selection. And it's not just based on biotic factors like predators, it's also based on abiotic factors like the color of the rocks in the area that you live in, or the weather, like I said, the snow and that sort of thing. Those are all possibilities for things that could be driving forces behind the natural selection of different traits. Um, and because we know environments are constantly changing, that means that evolution is never really finished. Everything is a work in progress all the time. So, um, Louis Pasteur said, chance favors only the prepared mind. Well, in evolution, species that have more variation are more prepared to take on new environments. And because of that, are more likely to be able to survive variations in those environments. So that's the basis for our evolution unit. It's the whole idea that things change over time. In order to have that change occur, to have big changes, we need lots and lots of time, like a geologic time scale, as Lyle laid out. And because of that, we can have this natural selection of traits happening that leads to different species over the course of long, long periods of time. Hope this helps with Charles Darwin's history and how he sort of came to be the publisher of the ideas of natural selection. If you have questions, bring them to class and we will take care of them.